If we inspect the post method, we don't just get more information about it and see which arguments we can set, but we also see that it in the end returns a future. And I had a look at these future objects before in this course already. Future is a core class built into Dart, which builds an object, which generally is a normal object, but which gives us a method, the then method, that allows us to wait for a certain action to finish. Or actually, it doesn't allow us to wait for that. It doesn't pause our entire app until this is done. Instead, it allows us to define a function that should execute in the future, hence the name, once this action is done. So here for this post method, by default, the next line of code after HTTP post, so here it is where we create the product, will execute immediately after Dart executed this without waiting for the response to arrive here. So Dart treats this as done as soon as it sent the request off. It does not wait for the response. It immediately continues to the next line. And that's good, otherwise our application would be frozen until the response is there, which for Firebase doesn't take long because it's super fast, but other servers might be slower. Or imagine you have no internet connection or a slow internet connection, then it might take even longer, even if you have a fast server. So therefore, here we can add or call a method though on the result of post, which is this future object, and that's the then method. And then takes a function which it will execute once, in this case here, we have a response. And that's different for every future. Every future, you can build your own futures too, decides when it should treat itself as done, so to say. So when it should trigger this function. The future returned by post treats itself as done and triggers the function once the response is there. And conveniently, it gives us the response, that's what this indicates here, as an input to the function we pass to then. So here, inside of then, we actually have to pass in a function which receives the response. So here we get the response. And now inside of this function, we can work with that response. So not in the next line after post, because that will execute immediately, but only inside of the function we pass to then, because this function will not execute immediately. Instead, it's registered by Dart, and it's executed when this is done. It's a bit like registering a function for onPressed, where we also simply define a function either with a pointer at one of our functions or by adding an anonymous function, which implicitly also then just passes a pointer to onPressed, which will be executed when the user presses something. It's the same here. We define a function, and we could have a named function here too, at which we then point without parentheses to not execute it immediately, which will only execute once the operation is done. Here, I'm using an anonymous function, and now if we execute this logic here, inside of this function, now this will only run once the response is there, and not immediately. And we can see that effect if we go back and we add this again. Should be long enough so that we don't get a validation error. And now let me add that image here again, save that, and now you see it took a short while, fraction of a second, for this to appear. It wasn't instantly there. If we would have stored it in memory and done this outside of this then block, then it would have been there instantly, because that line would have been executed right after the request was sent off. It only took so long because we waited for the response, which is the case because we're executing this inside of this then block. Now the advantage of this is that we can now use data from the response. And it turns out that Firebase here actually sends us a response which contains this cryptic key, this unique ID which this actually is, which it automatically creates for us. And that's awesome, because then we get a really unique ID out of the box generated by Firebase. And often, of course, you'll work with backends, with servers that generate IDs for you, because you can do that much better on a server. To see what's inside of the response, we can simply print it here. Let's print the response and see what we get here. If we now save this and we add this one more time, we can later clear this on Firebase, of course, to get rid of all our dummy data. But if we add this one more time, we see we get back an instance of response, and to see what's in there, let's use JSON decode response.body. Because response is an object, and just like the request has a body, so some data we attach to it, a response also has a body. That is in JSON format, and with JSON decode, we can convert this from JSON into some data we can work with in Dart. And typically this will convert it into a map. So now if we save this one more time with this little addition here, if we create one more, just a test, and again I'll use my image here and save this, then we actually see this is what we get back. That's the converted map already. It's a map with a name key. And on that name key, we have that cryptic unique ID which Firebase automatically generates. So since we wait for the creation and storage of our product until this is done, we can now take advantage of this and not generate our dummy ID here, but instead take the ID we're getting here. So we can simply execute this code here to decode our response body. Then we know this is a map with a name key, so we can then access name like this to get that ID. And the advantage is that we now work with that ID which we also have on the server here in our front end. And that's what you generally want to do, because if you then ever need to send a delete request to the backend or something like that, you will need the ID on the server to identify this item, right? Because the server only knows its own IDs. So if you use the same IDs in your app, you never have the problem of having to match the backend ID with your frontend ID. Simply take the backend ID everywhere and you have no problems. And that's what we do here. We create a new product now on the front end, so in our Flutter app, add it to our local list of products, use the database ID for that creation, and then on the front end, we work with a perfect copy of what we have on the back end. That's the idea here. And with that, we're sending requests and we're waiting for that response to return. Now, obviously, it's a bit of a strange user experience that when we add something here, that we then have to wait for a short moment until this appears here in the list. This is a bit strange. It would be better if we would see some loading spinner here until we are done, so that we only go back here once this has been added and we have all the latest data again.